After watching the movie Alien Covenant, we get a clear answer to the question who created the xenomorphs. However, at the same time, we were never told how exactly this was done, which was disappointing by many. In this video, I'll try to answer the question as accurately as possible. I want you to dispel any doubts right away. According to Ridley Scott, the xenomorphs were created by David and no one else. These cocoons stored in the basement were not stolen, found, or recreated from engineers' blueprints. We know this from numerous statements by Ridley Scott and the android himself.
I found perfection here. I've created it. Perfect organism.
I'm aware of the novelization of Covenant and other books, the contents of which directly contradict what will be discussed below. However, I'll demonstrate clearly that the film provides enough clues to find the answers to many of its mysteries independently. It all began with the arrival on the planet Paradise. The pathogen unleashed by the android set out to destroy all non-plant life forms. The transformations began even before the virus made contact with the ground. The atmosphere was not sterile and was filled with various small insects, which were instantly infected and in turn started attacking larger organisms. The pathogen began to spread across the entire planet and after some time wiped out all life on its surface.
No birds, no animals, nothing.
David, not accustomed to idleness, began to explore the planet and gather information. Whenever he found something interesting, he would bring it to the lab and study it. Whether it was vegetation, engineered bodies, or hybrids formed after contact with the virus. Even in his cave, we wouldn't find any living organisms. All synthetic creatures are dead. The pathogen itself, like its derivatives, remain alive as long as there is something to impregnate. After 10 years, the planet was completely cleared.
10 years on. All that remains outside of the original virus are these gorgeous beasts.
The exception to this rule is the cocoons in David's basement. There are at least 12 specimens containing familiar facehuggers. So where did David get them? Let's investigate together and start unraveling this puzzle from the end. The android presents the cocoons as a result of his work, of which he is undoubtedly proud.
Come. This is what I wanted to show you. My successes.
The basement is dark, very damp, and yet warm enough given the visible condensation. It resembles the atmosphere in the ship's hold with cocoons from the original Alien.
A cave of some sort, but I don't know, but it's like the goddamn tropics in here.
These cocoons are quite large and bulky. Of course, the android possesses much greater strength than a human, but it's still difficult to imagine how he brought them here. Pay attention to their placement. The objects are placed on soil cleared of rocks and vegetation, each on a small, neatly arranged mound. Upon closer inspection, you can discover a root-like structure beneath them, which again refers back to the original film, where the cocoons were also presented as growing into the ground. Admit it, all of these remotely resembles the beds in a greenhouse, where an optimal environment for cultivating crops is maintained year-round. The question arises naturally. What if the cocoons were grown from the ground, like plants or mushrooms? The theory may seem absurd to you, but there is an enormous amount of evidence in its favor. Let's take a walk through the laboratory. One of David's cocoon is placed on the central table in a dissected state. The other one is in the corner of the room. As he approaches it, he talks about his experiments with hybridization, which means this is also the result of his work. Now, there's another crucial frame that's hard to overrate. You can notice several smaller specimens arranged in a row, increasing in size. size. This leads us to the idea that the android might have initially had smaller cocoons at his disposal and gradually, through some manipulation, adjusted their size, similar to a human who tries to breed a new plant species or enhance its characteristics through artificial selection. If this is the case and our speculations are correct, there must have been a prototype, an original species on which the final result was based. Let's not wander around and multiply entities without necessity. Fortunately, within the framework of the film, we are introduced to only one fully mutated species that remained after the planet was cleared. This species is a type of mushroom known as a puffball, which is found both on Earth and on Paradise. Their biospheres are similar. David noted in his records that on the engineer's planet this mushroom can be found everywhere due to the ideal weather conditions. Even before mutation, this species was toxic and contained spores inside, inhaling which could cause muscle spasms in humans. However, for the crew of the Covenant, encountering it resulted in more than just intoxication. Infection with the protomorph happened twice inside the crashed engineer's ship and on their approach to it. Inside the carcass was a genuine breeding grounds for cocoons. The ship fell on a slope from which numerous mountain streams flowed, creating something like a greenhouse in a tropical forest. This protected the mushrooms from direct sunlight and created the perfect humid environment for their mass maturation. The mushrooms mutated, which means they came into contact with the pathogen. Apparently, there was a leak during the crash, and the surrounding soil was saturated with it. As we know, the pathogen interacts with animals and leaves plants untouched. Mushrooms are a separate kingdom, combining features of both. Here's what David noted while studying the mushroom before its mutation. It's highly sensitive to heat. It's easily cultivated and can change depending on the surrounding environment in which it grows. Inside the cocoon are tiny spores, shaped like genitalia, according to the android's words, not mine, which require acidic fermentation for maturation. Look at the mushroom in cross-section. It looks like a cocoon, doesn't it? Add to that the fear of fire and the presence of acid inside. This is the future home for the facehugger. This was David's main secret. Returning once to the crash site, he discovered a remarkable symbiosis. The mutated tiny spores thrived in the acidic environment of the mushroom and did not perish along with the other fauna. This form became the basis for the synthetics' further experiments. To survive, the spore needed to be protected by a shell, which would also serve as a bait for humans, like a bright fruit with a seed inside, a description to which David paid enough attention. He referred to both the seed and the cocoon with the same word, pod. The android thoroughly studied the mushroom in the laboratory and then recreated identical condition for its cultivation in the basement. Let's go back to the alien from 79 and recall how the cocoons were created in that film. Remember the scene where Ripley discovered how the walls in one of the spaceship compartments began to grow organic matter. She saw Captain Dallas and Brett stuck in it, gradually transforming into cocoons as they were digested in the acidic environment. It created itself without direct involvement of the xenomorph. All he did was prepare the fertile ground and timely delivered the construction material in the form of human bodies. David did the same. In one of the deleted scenes, he and Oram, while descending into the basement, apply a substance under their noses, similar to what it used when visiting a morgue to protect against the sharp smell of corpses. And this is not surprising, because the soil in this cave is saturated with decomposing flesh. Thousands of different species of animals, insects, aquatic creatures, engineered bodies, and cut-out fragments of Elizabeth Shaw has been buried in this soil. All of this was sucked out from the depth of Earth and transformed into thousands of cocoons of various shapes and content. David's general work scheme looks as follows: soil preparation, saturating it with the black substance, and planting. Fertilization and nutrition, depending on which species of animals were brought here and fed to the cocoons, their final form transformed. Decomposition of tissues and the genetic material contained in the cells are crucial. This is related to how the black substance works, as explained further. Waiting and harvesting, impregnating the target with the contents of cocoon, birth and the study of their results, selection of successful mutation for use as material for the next planting cycle. As you can see, the scheme at its core is quite simple. David repeated it countless times over years of meticulous work on developing his perfect organism. All interesting results of the experiments were described and documented by him in the format of a book, which was released almost simultaneously with the movie. I approached its contents very carefully, fearing some artistic liberties from the authors. However, I found that these illustrations were created over 9 months by 2 artists, Dan Hallett and Matt Hatton, under Ridley Scott's supervision. Most of the pictures from here were used to decorate David's laboratory and the room with scrolls. Therefore, this book can confidently be seen as part of the film. By the way, the artist confirmed that the story of creation of protomorphs and what David did with Elizabeth was fully intended. We will try to reconstruct it ourselves now. But before moving on to a more detailed analysis of David's actions, I have to spend a couple of minutes explaining the principles of how the black substance works. This will be important later on. Evolution on planet Earth is an endless process of DNA replication and its mutation, which is solidified through natural selection. The technology of the engineers operates differently. DNA is not copied but destroyed and completely rebuilt. This provides flexibility, accelerates the process of evolution, and helps organisms adapt instantly to their environment. The xenomorph was inspired by a creature known as a parasitoid wasp. This insect lays eggs in other organisms, from which more wasps hatch. But the engineer's technology operates differently. If an organism infected with the pathogen, say, bites a human, it doesn't produce an identical organism, but rather a humanoid creature. In other words, DNA is not merely copied, it's mixed together into a common pool and then rebuilt using a complex algorithm depending on the current external factors. By adjusting these factors, David ultimately creates his masterpiece. If we examine the structure of the engineer's urn, we can see that it consists of 4 vials fused together and immersed in a gel-like substance. When the pathogen interacts with the substance, it transforms into a primitive multicellular organism, algae. When this pathogen attacks flesh, it fertilized cell by cell, disintegrating it. This process results in the formation of the algae and simple particles known as motes. Both of these simple forms will eventually be transformed by David into more complex ones. In the book detailing David's work, the chronology of events is clearly traced, and the story is told through illustration and 3-act structure. The android began his work with observation and collecting information about the world around him. He gathered and cataloged fruits and flowers, shrubs and leaves, mushrooms and seashells. Much time was also devoted to studying the bodies of the engineers, especially their muscle and bone tissues. All this knowledge, as we will see later, will find application. At some point, there is a transition from the harmless description of the natural world to the practice of hybridization. It's as if cocoons, mutated engineers, and grotesque deformed embryos suddenly appear out of nowhere. David begins to create many tiny spores nested in the mutated fungus, acting collectively like a swarm. The special special effects studio working on the project mentioned that they tried to make a resemble of facehugger alien in shape. Each of these spores can bore through the victim's skin and deposit eggs directly into the bloodstream. However, David found this method of fertilization imperfect. Its results were unpredictable and depend on the point of entry and where the eggs would eventually be delivered through the bloodstream. This randomness led to birth occurring in random parts of the organism. The resulting creature also required several improvements. Here's a drawing of the first prototype of the facehugger from David's book, obtained as a result of experiments. There are many similarities to the initial spore, but there are also several important differences. The object gradually increased in size by the android, while the number of spores inside the cocoon decreased until only one remained. Its weight significantly increased. The tiny cilia for movement in the air no longer held any value and were in the process of atrophying. Limbs for surface movement, on the other hand, strengthened. The proboscis reduced in size, and its appearance became more similar to the final result. The sac with eggs splits. A tail appeared, with which the creature learned to escape from the cocoon. It did this clumsily at first, but David would improve it in the future, and the facehugger would jump out more adeptly. The work continued. Each subsequent seeding involved adding new genetic material to the previous one. Various fauna species, from insects to mollusks, were involved. David collected the former using special trap flowers, while the latter come from marine expedition that took place. The design of the facehugger was based on a creature called the crocotus. It closely resembled facehugger both in appearance and structure. This creature served as a source of limbs, evident from David's keen interest in them and their resemblance to the final result. Inspiration was drawn from everywhere. All the natural diversity was dissected and became fertilizer for the garden, depending on what interested David. It was a kind of constructor, giving birth to a huge variety of cocoons and their contents. The synthetic went through numerous options, studying the internal organs of the facehuggers, their skeletons, tendons, muscle tissues, and so on. The catalog included unsuccessful mutations, which for various reasons seemed interesting to him. Here are a few examples. Excessive enlargement of the ovaries and the absence of a tail, resulting in clumsiness and an inability to escape from the cocoon. Even distribution of internal organs throughout the body and increased vulnerability of the tail. Removal of the tail from this specimen didn't matter. Its body was protected by a dense layer of a bony shell, making the facehugger extremely unwieldy. An example of a complete failed mutation, accompanied by the degradation of flesh and muscle tissue. Interestingly, David also used plant DNA in his work, one of which I can't help but mention in this video. Not all illustrations created for the movie made it into the book for unknown reason, but the artist shared them on their social media. There are numerous drawings of the weeping fruit that definitely caught the android's interest, given the number of illustrations. Externally, it was something that barely resembled a fruit. The hybrid grew close to the ground, constantly dripping juice from its core. It's hard to say how this fruit, which according to the android resembled external organs, came to be this way, but its interaction with the pathogen is more than likely. I bet that the weeping fruit was used for feeding the cocoons. Just look at their external similarities. Naturally, successful facehugger forms were tested on victims, and a vast number of embryo sketches serve as the best evidence. Many of them exhibited visible signs of a xenomorph, such as an elongated head and sprouts on the back. The text below this picture gives us an idea of what the android aimed to achieve in his work. According to David, the engineers had weak bone density, so he rectified this flaw in his creations. He found the solution while studying plant and mineral cell structures. He incorporated stronger composite chitin compounds into his masterpiece. Attention is also drawn to the fact that human offspring are born frail and defenseless with limited mutability. This was one of the first things that David corrected. It was achieved in part by introducing genes from animals whose development depends on environmental conditions. Pregnancy, birth, and growth of the xenomorphs needed to happen as quickly as possible. David tried to maximize the potential of frequency occurring mutations. For example, many engineer embryos were born with hydrocephalus, brain swelling, which in our reality looks simply horrifying. But David found an application for this defect. It seems that the humanoid orbits could be better served as thermal pits, while the brain pan should be extended to allow for a broad spectrum reflector reception area. Here's the answer to the question, how do xenomorphs see? The artist further commented on this moment as follows. If you scroll down to the detail of the alien fetus, you'll see the radiation waves around the head and an explanation of how it sees thermally, a bit like a snake, which I thought both explained the seeming lack of eyes and would be a nice twist on why it hates fire, not being burned so much as being blinded by the heat. Snakes, like vipers, can sense prey through special heat-sensing pits filled with protein, which are activated due to the thermal radiation emitted by the prey. Xenomorphs see in a similar way, just with a much stronger mechanism. Here it is, practically the perfect facehugger specimen created by David. Its advantages are undeniable. He will lay an egg inside a human through the mouth, placing it in the most favorable environment, the stomach acid, and it will fully utilize the host's resources during its growth. A new flexible proboscis for deeper and higher quality impregnation, which happens even faster. Optimal internal composition and organ placement. The perfect skeleton. David compares the tail to the engineer's leg appendage, capturing the prey with limbs inspired by his hands. A victim of violence should not make unnecessary sound. The born creature also differs significantly from the neomorph, but I'll skip their comparison in this video. You can easily find the material online. It should be understood that David does not consider this version of the xenomorphs as final. After all, the xenomorph is a biomechanical creature, and further development was assumed in the next films. David's masterpiece was not completed due to a shortage of test subjects. According to the information from the book, engineers were used, both survivors of the bombing and reanimated ones. How he managed to bring them back to life is a mystery, but the fact that this has happened is undeniable. David described many discoveries that were supposed to help him work with live subjects. He found apple worms that secreted a black protein similar to lacquer, helping to preserve the bodies of the engineers, preventing them from decomposing. This plant became a source of a powerful opiate that would help relieve the experimental subjects' pain. The extent to which David went in his creativity is illustrated by experiments on infants, as confirmed by the artist on his social media page. Where did he get them? It's not excluded that some women during the attack on Paradise were pregnant. Yes, judging by this picture in the fields, the android forced engineers to mate with each other, possibly precisely to study their pregnancies and children. Illustrators also mentioned that the story is intentionally preserved in a way that makes it impossible to reconstruct the full picture. Multiple errors were intentionally included in the text to emphasize the accumulation of problems for the android, left unattended for a long time. The idea was to leave the viewer alone with fragments of information. question their own reasoning and imagination. This especially applies to what happened to Elizabeth Shaw. Most likely, the girl remained alive for a long time, constantly under the influence of sedatives and opiates to suppress consciousness and pain sensitivity. Initially, her model was supposed to have open eyes, but Fassbender asked to change it because his appearance was too frightening. The illustrator confirmed that in this picture he depicted how the xenomorphs sustained Elizabeth's viability and prevented her from dying. Also, that this work, like others, should not be taken literally. Their goal is to stimulate the viewer's imagination and demonstrate David's irreversible plunge into his own fantasies and madness. Elizabeth became the final chord of the deranged android. Parts of her flesh were served and used in the growth of the cocoons. So Shaw's fate is unenviable, and what David did to her is terrible. As you can understood, showing this in any way on the cinema screen is hardly possible. This is one of the reasons why these films are full of mysteries and unfinished stories, because the complete history of the creation of the xenomorphs is shocking and must remain shrouded in mystery.